it away.
Excellent. Margaret, thank you so much for providing this opportunity for me to present to the Vermont Science Teachers Association Annual Conference. I really love the title, Steaming Ahead, Equity and Integration in Science Education. Fantastic. I mean, that's what it's really all about right now. And what I hope today, this small session, this 1 hour drink from a fire hose, might give us some understanding of how to be able to bring in classroom assessment into a classroom without having to go through a psychometric course and try to figure out all the bells and whistles behind assessment, and make it so it's meaningful for your students. I'm going to put in the chat box, and by the way, those who are on the call right now, use that chat box as a lifeline, whether you have questions. Well, I'm going to be sharing resources there. Whatever you have on your mind, try to put in that chat box. I'm going to have it open on the side over here. So here's how you can get to the resources that we're going to be using today, and I'm going to be referring that as going forward. So a little bit about myself. I am calling in from North Kingstown, Rhode Island. I'm looking out the window at a wonderfully dark and clear night with the moon rising. And my background, just to give you an idea of why you might want to listen to me, is my background is I've spent most of my time as a teacher at middle school and then high school, went to the Department of Ed in the state of Rhode Island, worked very strongly with Vermont Department of Ed, the Vermont agency, I should say. And then I had the wonderful occasion of getting involved with the Next Generation Science Standards writing team. But more importantly, since we wrote the standards, that was back in 2013 when we released, there's a lot of learning because of the fact there's a lot of questions out there as far as how to be able to bring this into the classroom. And that's where the majority of my work has been. How do I help teachers implement the shifts of these three-dimensional science standards into their classroom? I have been blessed to be a teacher, and I think like a teacher, and I want to be able to see if I can help teachers be able to make sense out of these standards that are fairly complex. By design, they're complex. But in this session, what I want to be able to do is take where teachers have been. They've been making some nice project in creating three-dimensional lessons, but to finish the job. In other words, how do you assess three-dimensionally in a way that's going to be meaningful for the student, but at the same token, meaningful for the teacher so that you're going to be able to garner information. One last thing I need to say, I am a statistic. I tested positive for COVID last Friday. So if I'm clearing my throat or reaching for my box of handkerchiefs, my Kleenexes, please excuse me, but I'm on the mend. I'm on the other side. So just forgive any type of strange noises coming from my throat or my nose. So let's move on. So this is what we're going to be doing today.
Peter, I just wanted to let you know that you put your tiny URL, but some of us are requesting, we've got to request access.
Oh, no. Okay, let me take care of that right now. I'm sorry. I thought I already took care of that.
No, it's okay. Sorry to interrupt.
I appreciate that. Let me do that right away. I just got to get out of this for a minute. Escape.
Oh, good. Now I can say hi to Peter. Hi, Peter.
Hey, Kathy Renfrew, how are you? How did you go last night? Everybody, if you hadn't had a chance to get on Kathy's session last night, you missed out.
Thank you, Peter.
Let's see here. That's where we're going to go. So I'm going to just go here, just put that in. I apologize, everyone. I thought I double, triple check this, and I'm just going to make sure that everybody can get here.
Maggie, can you share it in the chat, please?
I will. I will.
Oh, thank you, Peter.
Anyone with the link? This
I-
should work now.
It does.
I'm there.
Let me in. Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. Thank you for bringing that up. And that's it. That's the power of communication. You're the best. All right. Where was I? Oh, yes. I was talking about what we're going to be doing tonight. So let's go there. 3 things. And that's a big 3 things in an hour session. How can we explore how assessment can follow 3-dimensional learning in the classroom? You want to have it so it's cohesive. How do you make it so that students that experience a 3-dimensional instruction, they need to experience 3-dimensional assessment? But you as teachers, you don't want to go crazy in creating that. We need to decomplicate the exercise, and that's what I hope we'll do. The second thing we're going to do is to go into breakouts, and I want you to identify some components that would be essential for an individual student performance. Okay, and I'll talk more about what I mean by the individual student performance. And then lastly, I'm going to share with you a template, and I want you to review it and maybe in the future use it to be able to create your own individual student performances for your own lessons or for lessons that you're borrowing. Just something that you can still keep that 3-dimensional theme going. So the key with anything is always make sure you don't do it alone. Collaboration is the key. You need to have someone that you're going to bounce off ideas from, or to be able to say, I like that idea, but it would be a little bit better if we did this, or you need to have discourse. The same reason why you have students work in groups is the same reason why you want to have colleagues together when you're designing. It's that power of shared learning to be able to share your experience and your feedback. So please use that as a mantra. But here's the elephant in the room. Excuse me. This has been a common discussion ever since the standards first came out. And, Vermont, very similar to Rhode Island, we came out in that first year, 2013. But I know there's a host of people on this call that aren't necessarily in that early sequence. But the bottom line is, every time I talk with teachers that are implementing new standards, whether they started out in 2013, or in the case of Minnesota, I saw my colleague John Olson that came out in 2019. The elephant in the room always is, why don't we just assess the way we already did? And so you see over here on the left-hand side, the pros and cons. Traditional assessment is certainly easier. I mean, a lot of the textbook publishers, they're already putting in assessments. All you have to do is bring them out and put them at the end of the unit, you're done. And they're easy to score, blah, blah, blah. But here's the cons. What we're really trying to do is shifting, and I have to give credit to so many teachers out there. You have all been not heroic during this past year and a half, 2 years almost, but B, so professional, because you are trying to make science real for students. And to do that, you need to have students embrace practices, structure their thinking by cross-cutting concepts, and have them use those 2 dimensions to get deeper into the core ideas. And so if we don't assess 3-dimensionally, then really the traditional, the instruction that we're doing, the shifts we're doing in instruction are moot. They don't make any difference because it's going to be a break. And it also does not give you any evidence that you can use for meaningful assessment information of how the students are doing. And lastly, I would be willing to bet in your state science assessment, the state science assessment is going to be 3-dimensional. Your classroom assessment needs to be needs to be three-dimensional assessment. So I kind of borrowed this. There's a famous quote, keep the main thing the main thing. In assessment, keep the main thing the main thing. You don't have to. And by the way, this is where my 12-step program comes into play for being a classroom teacher before NGSS. If there's a 12-step program for that type of teacher, I would be in it, because I was the guy that would put out at the end of the year 100-question multiple choice science assessment. I did all the things that I'm trying to get you to go away from. I want to write a apology to every student I ever taught. But the bottom line is, you don't need a plethora of stuff. You don't need a lot of items to be able to get to the student understanding. What you want to be able to do, by the way, is have your students demonstrate. They're not going to demonstrate with a multiple choice or even a constructive response. You want to have them demonstrate what they know. And when you say demonstrate, I'm thinking about something that you can have them actually do a mini performance. And lastly, you want to know, do the students know how to use a practice? Do they know how to use the cross-cutting concept to structure their thinking? And did they get the core idea that you're really trying to focus them on in the lesson? So keep that main thing the main thing, but don't think you have to make it big to get meaningful information. So here's the thinking behind the individual student performances. So I use that term, individual student performances. They came from the NGSS. The next generation science standards are written as performance expectations. When we were writing these, we were told by our boss, Stephen Pruitt, that when you're writing a performance expectation, you should be able to close your eyes, have someone read the performance expectation, and in your mind's eye, imagine a student actually doing that. So like, for instance, these four ranging from high school to middle school to elementary school, develop and use a model to describe the function of a cell as a whole and the parts the cells contribute to the function. I can see a student doing that, developing a model or constructing an explanation based on evidence of the role of photosynthesis. So with that thinking in mind, when you remember, these performance expectations are at the end of instruction or at the end of a course or at the end of a grade band. These performance expectations are what a student we should reasonably expect the student to be able to do at the end of that term. Let's apply that to your classroom. If you're teaching a lesson, you want to know, did the student get the lesson? Did the student know how to use a practice? And does the student know how to use a cross-cutting concept to focus in on an aspect of the phenomenon? Here's what's different about this. When you're doing a lesson, chances are that students are working in groups. And so you as a teacher are going to be walking around, formatively assessing, asking questions, listening in, determining are they on the right track, looking over the shoulder, which is great. They're working in groups. They're making some progress. You as a teacher can guide them along and formatively shift the focus that they're having. They're having some problems, use some prompts to be able to get them back on track. But that's for a group. How do you know whether or not out of four individuals, Johnny's getting it, or Jill's getting it, or Peter's getting it, or Patricia's getting it? That's where the individual student performance comes in. But they shouldn't see something different in that individual student performance from what they just experienced in the lesson. Now, again, lessons could be 1 day, 2 days. I've seen 3 or 4 day lessons, but you want to be able to garner, did they get it at the end? So if you look at these are individual student performances. And again, think of what I just said. Can you close your eyes and imagine a student doing that? Is it reasonable? Is it something that involves the 3 dimensions? And I think you all agree, obviously with the color coding, it really helped it, but you want to be able to see, what they are actually expected to do. And it is going to be a performance. It doesn't mean they're going to be jumping out of the chair and start acting out. They're going to deliver something to you as a teacher that you can assess relatively quickly to say they're getting it. I see how they use the practice. I see how they use the cross-cutting concept to focus their thinking on the core idea. And then the core idea, are they getting how that works based on the lesson? So if we were going to design an ISP, 3 questions that you as an educator might want to ask yourself. Think about right now a lesson that you have, something that you're very proud of. Maybe it's even a traditional lesson that you are adapting, whatever. But 3 questions. How do you measure the individual student understanding of the central concept of that core idea? And how do you know if a student is actively using the science and engineering practice? And lastly, are they using the cross-cutting concepts to structure their thinking? Here's the big break, folks. Back in the days of traditional assessment, when this young man was teaching middle school, I would have done that 3 separate components. I would do something where I want to be able to see, you know, are they getting the core ideas? So I might check their facts and see how they're doing. Or maybe I'll ask them about a practice, or maybe I'll ask them about a cross-cutting concept. It's not, that doesn't follow behind the lesson you created, because you're integrating the 3 dimensions in the lesson. So we need to integrate this in that assessment. So here's where I want to do a breakout, and I'm gonna knock on wood someplace that you be able to get there. But I'm going to, and you should be able to get to the URL now that I made it okay. But when you go in that URL and you come to a folder, you're going to find 3 folders: 1 for elementary, 1 for middle, and 1 for high school. Now, these breakouts are going to be random, and I'm going to ask Maggie and or someone to be able to put you into those breakout rooms. So you're not going to be in breakout rooms that are going to be, oh, you're an elementary breakout, or you're a middle. You just make your decision. Look at all 3 if you'd like, but get a piece of paper out, have a notebook, and jot down 3 things. What's the main concept that the student is going to be learning as a result of this lesson? There may be a couple, but what do you think the main concept is? What's the dominant practice? Again, with all lessons, you're going to have multiple practices, but what's the dominant practice that you feel could be the practice that you want to get most information about? And lastly, what's the cross-cutting concept that showed up that would really help the students focus in on the aspect of the phenomenon? So these lessons, by the way, come from my colleague Brett Molding's Going 3D with GRC. I'm going to share that at the end. But I want you just to look at that with those 3 questions in mind. What's the dominant concept? What's the major practice? Choose one. What do you think is the boss practice out of that lesson? And what's the major cross-cutting concept that's really helping the students focus in? So let me just open up the chat box. Do we have any questions in the chat box before we go there? I just want to make sure. Nope, so far so good. Let's go to the breakout rooms for 6 minutes, okay? And then we're going to come back, and I want to hear what you see with those lessons would be. What's the big idea, the core idea? What's the practice, and what's the cross-cutting concept? Okay, breakout.
I opened all the rooms, right? Yeah. Yep. People are going, woohoo.
Maggie, how many people we have on the call today?
Now you're asking me 3, 6, 9.
10, 11?
12, and then you and I.
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry, I'm literally like in my own PBL world right now.
I know. You can't get away from it. It's the nature of your work.
Yeah, I know. My husband hears it when I walk when I walk around, and he hears me bitching and complaining, arguing. Like, oh, it's just like today we had a huge meeting about it. Tomorrow I have to defend what I did. And then I have my performance eval on Friday. And I'm just like, this can go very, very badly. Like, oh God. But I remember what Simone said when we were reviewing items. Is that, that's not a mountain I want to die on.
Yep, that's right.
But you know what, Peter, this is a mountain that I've seen the mountain. I was like, this is the mountain. This is the mountain I'm going to die on. And I'm like, holy moly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I'll message you because I have time tomorrow at 7:30. And you want to have a cup of coffee and a bagel with some schmear.
Schmear. I like the good pronunciation.
Schmear. Yeah.
My ex-wife was German, and Yiddish are very similar in terms of pronunciations and what have you. So,
growing up in Metro New York, I didn't really recognize how. I'm going to pause the recording because I just realized I'm continuing to record. I started recording again. But yeah, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4.
Wow.
well, welcome back, everyone. I hope that everybody had a chance to access the lessons. And what I'm going to do is I am going to shift out here, and I'm going to bring up each lesson. I just love to hear your feedback. What's the main core idea? Come on. All right, so let's start off. This is the elementary lesson. You're so vain. This is from Hawaii. So feedback, either use the chat box or would love to hear your voice. What's the main core idea that you think the students are going to be going after with this?
So Peter, I'm not seeing the lesson if that's what, I'm just seeing the bar across the top. Maybe other people does anybody else see the whole lesson?
No, I'm not seeing it either, Myra.
Okay.
Not seeing the whole lesson. Oh my goodness.
No, I'm just seeing the toolbar across the top.
Stop share and let me reshare. Let's see here. I apologize for that. Thank you for sharing. All right, let's try it again. How are we doing?
Now it's good.
All right, there we are. So what's the big idea here? What's the core idea that's going on?
Structure, internal and external, the structures of the plant, basically.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Did anybody pick out a dominant practice? What do you think is the main practice that's going to be really important in this lesson that the students are going to embrace?
Well, Peter, I thought this one was interesting because as you scroll down, there's a difference in what the group practices are and what the individual's practice is. If you just keep scrolling down that lesson. So the individual performance is about developing an argument based on explanation.
Sure.
But the group is doing a whole bunch of other stuff together.
But Myra, what do you think? What do you think?
I thought that this was really important for models, but I don't think everybody else would necessarily think that was the same. But that's my thought.
Okay.
But
But,
I thought that was interesting that the modeling is done in this lesson as a group, and the individual performance as listed in this lesson is done as a construct an argument.
Okay. Thank you, Mario. How about cross-cutting concepts? I think that'd be fairly evident.
Yeah.
Structure and function seems to be the thing, although there are patterns in there.
Patterns too, right?
Let's look at middle school. Everybody seeing that?
yes,
Big idea behind this. There's two performance expectations with this one. But if you're looking at, again, you're looking at the leaves are darker on the top compared to the underside. What do we want the students to come away with?
Well, those of us who talked about this, we felt that this lesson leaned more heavily on the first standard, the MSLS 1-2, that it was really setting students up for learning about the role of photosynthesis, but it was still talking about the structure and function of the parts within the cell.
Excellent. And what do we think for practice?
We thought,
Oh, go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry. We thought a couple of practices. I mean, I think the modeling and then the constructing an argument. The third practice of obtaining information was there, but we thought that was kind of probably not as prevalent as the first two in terms of the student expectations.
And that's a great pickup there. And I appreciate you saying that, because if you're doing this as a classroom assessment, obtaining information, you're going to have to either provide the student with that information, or you're going to have to give the student time to go and dig it out. It's a tough one to assess in this kind of individual performance. It's used a lot in the lesson, but I appreciate your focus on that.
Peter, we actually said, I'll go, John, are you going to talk about our group and what we said about the practices?
Well, yeah, one comment that I thought is, if you're really looking to see which practice was actually taught, actually learned, you really need to think about which practice are they probably better at the end of the lesson than they were at the beginning of the lesson.
That's
And
great.
even though modeling is being used, they really don't learn how to do modeling in this lesson. They learn a little bit more about how to construct an explanation. And that's probably the area that they probably improved upon through this lesson.
Excellent. Well, I agree with you. I really like what you said, John, in that
so,
you want to be able to have it so that what is it that the student's going to come away with more experience with? Kathy, what were you going to say?
so I'm thinking about how science talk and listening to students is really important to me. So I'm thinking that that discussion that's happening where kids are asking questions is really, I'm also learning enough, and I can assess them on that piece of it, thinking about the patterns that they really do talk about as part of the discussion.
Great for bringing that up. And Kathy, the reason why I really like that, as well as John's point, is that each teacher, when they design a lesson, are going to have in their mind what it is that they want more information about. So there's really no right or wrong answer with this, but what you're all doing is probably the one thing that would be consistent would be, what's the disciplinary core idea? What's the concept you want them to know? The practice and the cross-cutting concept, that's a choice. However, the one thing you don't want to do is pull a practice out that's not part of the lesson, or a cross-cutting concept that's not part of the lesson.
Yeah, I was going to say that you might want to be, when you're thinking about like actually designing assessment, you really have to attend to that, because you don't want to be reporting out on something that you don't actually have the data to support. So be very mindful of what SEPs and CCCs are there. It becomes critical.
Exactly right. And so similar to the SATE assessment, The state assessment, you can't ask about a practice that's not part of the performance expectation. It would not be a fair playing field if you ask about a practice that's not part of that lesson to the student. You want to have that experience for the student to be parallel with the lesson. So let me just show you, and in interest of time, I know we didn't get a chance to talk to high school, but let me show you what elementary came up with. This is what, and Myra brought up the fact that they talked about explanation or argument from evidence. But here's what they were, oh gosh, I'm sorry. There it is. Elementary, they wanted to develop an argument. Now, this is what the lesson writer came up with, the individual student performance. And they came up with also a range of different student responses. And you all have access to this PowerPoint, so that you don't have to worry about being lost with this. But notice that the individual student performances, they're going to develop an argument about how the plants have internal and external structures that function to help plants live and grow. That could easily be develop a model or something to that effect. Here's middle school, another one where we're talking about developing an argument. Again, this is what the individual that wrote the lesson came up with, identifying. But again, you folks could reasonably make an argument that is, I'd like to see another practice in there or another cross-cutting concept. And lastly, here's high school that we didn't get a chance to discuss, but hopefully this validates what you already came up with in your group. That models are an incredibly important practice. And what they chose was systems within the leaf. They didn't go with structure and function. They talked about the leaf as a system. So as a teacher, you are the person that's going to say, okay, what's consistent? What's the core idea that you want to see if they're understanding? But use the practice and the cross-cutting concept to best help the student demonstrate their understanding. Remember, these are individual students reacting to this. So using those 3 individual performance expectations, whether you agree with them or not, can we apply that into a simple template? So if you look at the function of that, this is basically what you saw. You start with a practice, and then you have something that's going to bring them into the core idea, but they're also going to be mentioning a cross-cutting concept to structure their thinking. Remember, that cross-cutting concept is how the student looks at the phenomenon that they experience through the lesson. It focuses them in on a specific aspect. If you say patterns, they're going to look at patterns. If you think it's structure and function, they're going to look at structure and function. It's more of a metacognitive dimension rather than the practices where they're actually doing something. And so if we took something and applied it into the template, develop a model to explain how the temperature of air causes the glass to shed water to form rings on a coffee table. Notice that it doesn't mean in this case, it starts off with a practice, but it doesn't mean you have to end it with a cross-cutting concept. It just has to be something that's going to make sense with that. And so think about what I asked you to review. When you're designing an individual student performance, a couple of questions or 3 questions you should ask. You should be able to have the same phenomenon on the lesson for that particular individual student performance, or you can use an analogous phenomenon. For those of you who don't know, if you're studying condensation, the analogous phenomenon might be about cloud formation. It's the same concept, but just a little bit different. I'm doing on the simpler side, use the same phenomenon of the lesson. Does the ISP, the individual student performance, use the 3 dimensions? If you're only looking at practices and the the core idea, it's not really three-dimensional. You have to unfold in that cross-cutting concept. Oh, and by the way, folks, this is an excellent way for teachers to get cross-cutting concepts more under their belt, to be able to use them to structure the student thinking for that individual student performance. And those people that know me know that, I heart cross-cutting concepts. That's my big thing. And does the ISP require the students to use reasoning? I've been quoted many times to say the NGSS is where level 1 DOK go to die. You have to have students reason out something. You're not going to find out just a fact. They've got to think about something and show you the thinking by demonstrating this ISP. So here are the 3 steps. First of all, start small. What's the component of the DCI that you're trying to be able to get for that lesson? You know that when you wrote the lesson or you reviewed the lesson, you know what that would be. And just think of a conceptual nugget from that lesson to use in the ISP. This next step is figure out the practice. Now, many of you have probably seen this off on the right. Brett Molding uses this a lot of times to show that practices are not linear. They're not hierarchical. They use practices over and over again in different parts of the lesson. But what you want to do in your lesson is, just as you all had a nice discussion, it doesn't mean that John's lesson is right because it's using models, and the same lesson when Myra was reviewing it uses argument. That doesn't mean they're wrong. It means you're focusing on different practices for the same lesson to get that information that you as the teacher want to get. And lastly, the cross-cutting concept. What's the cross-cutting concept that was used in the lesson that would most help the student be able to focus in on the aspect of that phenomenon so they can really dig into an explanation of it? And remember that in an ISP, sometimes you can use cross-cutting concept twice. Like, for instance, what's the cause of the patterns? Those duets are really important. But again, start small, go with 1, but you can use 2. And when you're designing the rubric, what I just shared with you before, very simple. What you want to do is write out a reasonable response. In this case, you're looking for a response that maybe an ELL student might be able to put forward. You don't want to put in something that might be a doctoral thesis, but something that's a reasonable explanation. And then from there, you can convert it to a 4-point rubric. What's full understanding? What's partial understanding? What's limited understanding? And then use that to be able to, if you wanted to make it summative, you could use that for a summative assessment. I would say it's more about being formative and helping you with your instruction. And lastly, if you're going to be creating this, share it with somebody else. Remember my second slide, don't do this by yourself, collaborate, share it, review it, revise it. And what's the 3D-ness of it? Does it have all the 3 dimensions? Are there students going to have words that might be difficult to interpret? This is a great chance to reinforce some of the vocabulary they're using in the lesson to be able to put that in. I'm not a proponent of putting a vocabulary board up there, a word wall. Let them discover the vocabulary and have them use it in the context of the investigation. And lastly, would the ISP provide you with some actionable evidence to help guide your instruction? In other words, do you know now how each of your students are learning, how they're doing? Or in Rhode Islandese, how they doing? Are they doing okay? Well, fine. That's what formative assessment is about. And then you as a teacher can go and revise your instruction. You may need to remediate, whatever. But this is information that we really need. And so if you wanted to do your own individual students' performance, there's a template for that. And if you go back into the folder, this is my rough attempt to be able to give people a scaffold. So if I, and by the way, this, what we're sharing tonight, this 1 hour, is something I do normally over 3 hours, where I actually have people write out some individual student performances. But what this is designed to be able to provide the teacher with, there's the practices, there's the cross-cutting concepts. There's your template here as far as what the model might be. There's an example. And then here's the space where you can write it. Now, this is all expandable, but when you're assessing the product, this might be a nice way to use a 4-point rubric to be able to get into an understanding of how the students are doing. Okay, and again, those guiding questions on the bottom, the 3D-ness of it. Did you include any words that may be challenging for your students? And are you going to benefit from it? Are you, the teacher, going to benefit from this information? Are you going to be able to get a better understanding of how the student's doing? Like, for instance, drawing a model is not easy. I mean, a model, you need a lot of components. Are they labeling the model? Are they showing direction? Are they including all the components? There's a lot of stuff in a model that could really provide the explanation, which is why that practice of modeling can be used to have an initial explanation, or one that they're doing when they're doing the investigation, or one use a model when they're communicating their outcome. So all of this comes into play, but this template is yours to use. And more importantly, as you look at it, please do not be afraid to reach out to me and say, you know, this is nice, but it might be better if we did this. This is a learning process. I created this based on learning from teachers. And I hope that as you go through this, you may be suggesting something better that you might have found that worked better for you. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. All right, that's not what I wanted to do. This is what I wanted to do. Boink. There. So we're wrapping up here, and I purposely am going to reserve some time because I'd love to hear your feedback. And more importantly, I also know that you guys are having long days too. So I don't want to overstay my welcome here. But here are the key ideas. Classroom assessment should be integrally linked to the instruction. Remember that slide I showed you? Assessment drives instruction, but only if the instruction is NGSS and the assessment is NGSS. In other words, they're both three-dimensional. You can't have one. It's like wearing a plaid coat with a striped tie. You know, it just doesn't work. You want to make sure that's going to flow. All right. A good student, and this is something I've been talk all the time about in my assessment work. The student in the new standards, even though the standards have been out since 2013, they're still being implemented. I can remember when I was teaching, I had a colleague that taught 8th grade. I taught 8th grade, but kids would walk in this classroom, and as soon as they walked in, they saw a photocopied sheet on the desk and automatically know it's going to be a quiz or a test. And you could see them sink. I mean, I did the same thing, but not in the same manner. You don't want to deflate them. And no, I never saw a kid get excited with a paper test. If you do this right, it's going to be an extension of what they learn. Now they're going to have a chance to demonstrate on their own. So they're not going to see it as a test or an assessment. They're going to see it as extension of instruction. Important point, huge point, as far as when you're talking about engagement with the students. And there's one more point there. I put in Minnesota benchmarks, but that was just from a leftover from a presentation I did in Minnesota, but it could be Vermont, it could be Rhode Island, it could be Connecticut, it could be anywhere that if you wanted to align with your state standards, your state assessment is going to use 3 dimensions to be able to ask your student questions and get information. If you do this in the classroom, that is not going to be a foreign process for them when they sit down for that state assessment. They're going to see something very similar. And this little throughput is so important that, again, instruction guided by standards should be informed by assessment. And so you have the standards. The standards by themselves do very little, but only if you use them to guide your instruction. How do you engage those students using different practices and different cross-cutting concepts to get after core ideas, and then have that assessment to be able to see what's the student ability in those 3 dimensions, not just the facts. What's the 3 dimensions? Because chances are they got the facts more deeply because of the other 2 dimensions, the practices and the cross-cutting concepts. And this was a great resource, and I'm going to give the shout out to Brett Molding. I'm trusting that most of you have already seen this, but I'm going to just take a minute and just get that URL into the chat box. It's really easy. You just Google Going 3D with GRC. Put it in the chat box. People seeing my screen? Yes? So it's broken into elementary, middle, and high school. And it is multi-state. These are all created by teachers in a variety of states. When I'm working with Brett, or Brett has an individual workshop, we always ask teachers if they want to be able to develop lessons. And these lessons that come out of that are what you see. In fact, the 3 that I chose came from, I used them, I wanted to make sure that they all had a relationship as far as a scaffolding. 4th grade leaf structure, middle school leaf structure, high school leaf structure, to show how they build on each other. This is an incredible resource. And by the way, God forbid we ever have to go back to remote learning. Anytime you see, and I'll bring one up just for the sake of showing you, I'll just choose physical science by random. When you explore these lessons, anytime you see a red asterisk, you see this red asterisk here and another one here, that means that it can be done with materials that can be commonly found at home, or no materials whatsoever. So this is a great resource if you ever have to do any type of remote learning with your students. I apologize. Now, let's go back. If I could find it, there it is. No, there it is. No, that's not it. Where is it? Where'd it go? I can't find my PowerPoint, ladies and gentlemen. How embarrassing. I know what I'll do. Here's what I'll do. Right there. And I'll just scroll down. I put that picture in, Maggie, by the way, because that kind of looks like you, that person in the opening slide. I said, that could be Maggie. I'm not sure. But...
Strangely, I might have a sweatshirt just like that.
But let's go back. Thank you for your patience, folks. So I am going to stop here for a minute, leave that on the screen, but I really love to hear from you. First of all, questions. Do we have any questions? Let me open up the chat box to see if there are any questions that I missed in here. But I'd love to get any ideas from you. Again, this is designed to be simple. And what I mean by simple is not low level. It's meant to be able to allow teachers to be able to do this without maximizing their time that they already don't have. So, Chris, please share.
Yeah, I guess I was curious. It seems like some standards lend themselves to being assessed on a paper pencil test, and some really don't at all. I wondered if you had some kind of guidance about kind of those ones in the middle where you could kind of like shoehorn it down into a traditional, or you could do it, as like a lab-based kind of thing or something. Do you have any guidance or thoughts on kind of those middle ones, how to do that?
When you say middle ones, you're talking about ones that aren't written and ones that aren't computer-based, is like a lab investigation?
Well, like ones that you could kind of push one way or the other. If I could take a standard and I could make it into kind of a lab assessment type situation, or I could make it into something where a kid looks at a phenomenon on paper and has to do some sense making and has to then write an explanation. Like you could kind of do it either way. Do you always lean towards the performance piece, or?
Well, they're all going to be performance piece, Chris. The advantage you have as a classroom educator is that the state is handcuffed because they have to have something that is going to be able to be processed through a computer scoring. So they are limited as far as how they be able to create some of these scenarios and the items that they create for the state. You as a teacher, though, and you brought up a great point as far as a lab investigation. When you think about like, for instance, if you do a high school lab, when I was teaching high school, I'd have the pre-lab. I might even give them a demo to show them what the phenomena is. Then I give the lab that gives them the step-by-step procedure. And then I do a post-lab where I told them what they saw the day before, as well as in the pre-lab. And by then the saliva is coming out of their mouths. Whereas if you gave them the lab first without a pre-lab, maybe do a safety thing, it's okay to give them the procedure, and then the phenomenon that they're seeing is a result of the lab. That might be something you could use to be able to do an individual student performance. Like, for instance, before they get into the post-lab discussion, to get a sense of what they saw for the lab itself. In other words, use the result of the lab as a phenomenon rather than as what I used to do. I tell them what they're going to see. I give them a demo of what they're going to see. They do a lab and they see what I told them they're going to see. And then we do a post lab where we discuss it again. We took away all the magic and we took away all the engagement. Instead, if we do the lab first with safety and the procedure, as a result of that lab, you may be able to create an individual student performance that might allow you to have some information about what the students are perceiving with that lab. So I was just choosing the more complex of those choices you gave me when I'm thinking about a lab investigation. But when you're looking at these performance standards, performance expectations, they're really, really big. You're pulling out little pieces of those for each lesson. So the piece you're pulling out of that performance expectation is what you're going to be focused on the lesson on. And then building lessons, eventually they're going to have that full exposure to that performance expectation. Did that help at all? I hope it gave a little bit more insight.
Yeah. that was good. Thanks.
I appreciate it, Chris. And please, by the way, that's my email address. Please don't hesitate to give me an email or what have you. But and that's my cell phone number too. I take texts also. So other questions? Thank you for that, Chris. That was a good one. I appreciate it. Okay, hearing none. Maggie, I want to hand it back over to you.
Why?
I put your picture in front of there.
This is fantastic. Oh, sorry. What about phenomena first and allowing students to construct a lab? I use too many cookbook labs that simply had students recreate known results.
I didn't hear your full question.
What about phenomena first and allowing students to construct the lab? Shari says that she has used too many cookbook labs. So
Yeah.
like, right, that simply had students recreate known results.
I think that would be a really reasonable thing to do if you're doing a elementary investigation, or maybe in some cases middle school. But I think Chris might say, and anybody who teaches high school, you don't want to give them a phenomenon and let them design a lab in a high school chemistry class. There's also that duty of care you have to always worry about. So, but elementary, I would argue that, yeah, here's a phenomenon. Can you do that?
So one of the, and this kind of goes to that idea, right? So not only was I a product of New York curriculum, because I went to school in New York, but also I got my teaching license in New York. So it was very like regions oriented. You're teaching to the test. You're only teaching oceanography one day because there's 2 questions on the test. So when I left that system and came to Vermont is, more proficiency based. They were like full forward on the NGSS. And being at the state level, I dropped into the chat. We were using, and we developed and continue to develop a performance assessment template. And we create proficiency scales and rubrics from those proficiency scales,
Yes.
When I went and took some of those cookbook labs that were given to me as a pre-service teacher,
Yeah.
using the tools that we had at the Agency of Ed, I deconstructed it and rebuilt it so that it was 3-dimensional. I could still use like the graphing part, but I put it in a different spot. I added more. I took away like other pieces, and that's kind of how I address that cookbookness without having to totally recreate the wheel.
And I agree. I mean, back in the early days of NGSS, we came out with a comparison between traditional labs and 3-dimensional labs, what might be able to do with that. But I just want to clarify, when I gave Chris that explanation, I was using information based upon a great paper by Roger Bybee and Rick Duschel that really addresses questions that come out of primarily about high school teachers, especially with those teachers that have duty of care. And so being able to have the safety factor by doing the performance first, the investigation first, is really helpful. And it takes away that boredom, so to speak, of seeing it over and over again and over 3 days. I fully agree that if you can put that forward, we've given them a phenomenon, and let the kids figure it out, I think that would be fine with some scaffolding. You give them some scaffolding. But again, you can still use at the end of that an individual student performance to be able to assess how not just your lab groups, but how your individual students did with that lab in a performance model. And Shari, I just noticed that you asked that question. Thank you for that question.
Well, and my experience of 31 years was in the high school classroom. And I found it as my responsibility to essentially start to wean the students off of, here's the lab, here's the procedure, follow this step by step. I wanted them to then be able to move into the process of, here's my problem. How could I test that? How could I experiment for that?
So
Well, that's great. So like, for instance, before if you're pre-lab, instead of telling them what the lab's going to be about, if you give them the concept and allow the students to be able to problem solve what the procedure might be, even though you as a teacher know what they're going to get, it allows them to have some say in the investigation. It's not like, here it is, you don't have any say in it. You know where they're going to go. So by asking the right questions, they're probably going to get to where you want them to be. Am I hitting that okay?
Right. So instead of being essentially a reading test to assess how well they can follow directions, now I'm looking at how clearly can they problem solve. And then I would never let them proceed without a checkoff or a sign off from me first.
Yeah.
To be sure that it would be safe. And obviously there's also a limit in terms of what I might have available for resources. But
Yes.
I think that at the high school level, weaning them off from that rote lab that's only regurgitating known results,
Yes.
and let's find out how to think like a scientist was a huge help.
I have no argument with your concept. I have no argument with that concept. I think that would be, again, we're talking the same thing. We're trying to provide that engagement of the phenomenon in different ways. But instead of just showing a demo and saying, here's a phenomenon, they've seen it. Now there's different ways to engage the students. So I fully support your strategy.
yeah, I was gonna say, I know that Shari, I think you were there. I can't remember. Adriana was there at the previous session regarding science research and how to start a science research program. And I just reflecting on my own practice, when I had my 9th graders, they came in wet behind the ears. I had to be very intentional and scaffold them into independent thinking because they were so used to being spoon fed. But by the time they got into my 11th grade physics class, it was more of that, okay, now we're going to be dropping the ropes a little bit more, a little bit faster.
Yeah.
So it's here's this thing. What do you notice? What are we doing? And it was more design based and everything like that. But, the previous session regarding science research has kind of broken that, where I'm yes, that's the way that we need to go. How do we get there?
Yes.
But definitely, being very mindful also at the state level when we're thinking about comprehensive assessment systems and formative assessments and how we bring those into things. And sometimes it's you have teachers that are we're there, we're going to do it. And you have others where you're come this way.
Well, with that being said, and what Chris shared, what Sherry shared, and what you elaborated on, do you see where individual student performances can fit in those strata? I mean, again, you want to be able to say, are they using the practices? Are they using the cross-cutting concept? Do they get the big idea? And I think that no matter which way you're doing it, I love Sherry's idea, or whether you do the investigation first as expounded by Duschel and Bybee, you can still use that ISP at the end of the investigation to have a measurement for the teacher to be able to come forward. Bar lab reports and what have you, which, that's not something I want to get into. But again, a simple idea of getting a sense of where your students are. If you can.
And I would also agree with you, Peter, that it is critical to provide an experience for the students, that's what becomes engaging, and it is also an equity issue in terms of
Yes.
leveling the playing field.
Leveling the playing field. Yeah,
Yes.
I agree, Sherry.
Shari, perfectly said. And again, you know, I think back to when I was teaching and how I put those tests and quizzes out there and just see kids just not engage with it. How can we still have kids engage and see the excitement and allow them to be able to share what they know? That's what the key is. And you're absolutely right. That's one of the reasons I'm excited to share this conference, because I think this is a great strategy for equity, to be able to allow all students to be able to demonstrate their performance with a simple ISP.
I think one of the tricky parts of assessing a couple of the dimensions is to understand how well the students have progressed in that dimension. So for example, if we're talking about model development, how well can the students explain the strengths and limitations of their models? How well can they critique other models? And if they're not able to do that in this lesson well, how can I build that into the next time they do model development, maybe even in a completely different topic? And how can I strengthen their ability to do that? And I think the charts that the appendices of NGSS have, which talk about level of understanding, we're looking at the various grade ranges, can be helpful in designing the way we look at the products that the students give us.
Yeah, I agree with that, John. This is, if you can imagine in a perfect world that we do this over K through 12, where students are experiencing the practices as a progression, so that your expectation of a fifth grade use of models is going to be different from a second grader's use of models, but they progress. Again, these ISPs are going to be very revealing to teachers, let's say in the ninth grade level, and you have develop a model, for instance, and they're not doing the basics. So this is, I hope it doesn't come to that kind of a sore thumb type of awareness, but you're absolutely right. You need to be able to see how the students are progressing. I think that every one of us that taught could probably tell which teacher students came from or which school students came from when they came into your school, based on the awareness, right?
You know, it's really interesting that you say that, because so in Vermont, we're creating sample proficiency scales and how to reflect those into rubrics. So, you know, we're thinking a performance expectation would be assessed multiple times in a classroom, and that learning progression would be written on that scale. And one of the ways that we are attending to that progression is even like, all right, starting at like a beginning, or I don't remember what terminology you used for your level one, but actually thinking about it in terms of, you know, here we are with a high school, we want to keep the content the same. So let's borrow some of the cognitive complexity from end of middle school as the beginning, because that's where we're assuming that students really should be. And then moving them kind of along that progression. So by the end of course, end of year, they're at least minimally hitting that proficient mark, which is coming from the high school standard,
right?
You know, and we are at the state, we're seeing it as like, we need to write proficiency scales. We need to help educators translate into rubrics so that they can see that connection, and how it connects to a performance assessment or a formative assessment becomes critical, because everything is aligned, everything works together. And at least what we've been seeing in our state is that there is a disconnect between.
Could that be something you use the performance level descriptors from your assessment to help guide that?
I have.
There it is.
I have done so. But yeah.
It's about consistency. It's about consistency.
Yeah. I mean, that's the nice thing about being able to like have like, and you know, because you were talking about it earlier, being boots on ground classroom teacher, now being at the state and being able to connect it, because a lot of times we talk about like policy and like assessment and we don't connect it and it.
Yeah.
We
No,
shout
you're
to the
absolutely
void.
Yeah, no, that's great. Good point.
So I'm going to stop recording because it's 7:15 and Peter has given us extra time and you guys have given us.
Before you stop recording, let me go on and say, I so appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for your time.
I thought you were going to say go Bruins or something.
Oh, no, if they watched the game last night, no, the Bruins have a long way to go, that's for sure. But in all honesty, thank you all. It's great to see so many familiar faces and smiling faces.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all for the time.